it seems to me that one natural place for us to begin here is in just trying to first, I think, define a couple of things for our audience, although I think probably many people here are aware of much of what has been spoken about. But I guess the first thing that I would love to get a sense of myself is sort of the scope or scale of the issue. How many people in the United States, and what do we know about how those communities are distributed, but also how many people in the United States are living in communities right now that are either the current target of some sort of, I guess, sort of coordinated redevelopment effort about which we should all be thoughtful, and how many people are really living in what might be described as economically distressed communities. And I guess I'll throw that open to the panel in case there's someone who feels like they have some particular insight, but I think we just need to kind of lay that out first.
I can speak to Philadelphia as opposed to the entire United States. And like I said, places are different. But in Philadelphia, I think I recently read somewhere that if you would take the approximately 300 census tracts in the city of Philadelphia, you will find that maybe 5%, maybe somewhere in the area of 14% of the population, and maybe about 5% of the census tracts could be called gentrifying communities. We are a city where 1 in 4 households live in poverty. So if you were to take the big picture look at Philadelphia, there are more people living in concentrated poverty, and now there's new language talking about deep poverty, poverty that, you know, you're not just below the poverty line of $24,000 for a household of 4, but you're actually living, you know, below $12,000. So that's like just that place, but it's very different if you think of Oakland, or if you were to think of cities like Washington. You know, it's very different numbers. And so I think that's why it's important that as we have these conversations, that we think about our strategies reflecting. Now, for those 14% that are living in neighborhoods that are changing and changing rapidly, that's a big deal. So I think as policymakers, it doesn't mean you discount it or you triage it or whatever and say, oh, well, it's not important enough. But you just need to make sure that you understand, you know, when you're thinking about these issues, who is impacting and how it's impacting.
I could briefly say for Oklahoma, now granted, we do have some difficulty getting native data. It's just a challenge nationally, but, and we don't have it in terms of any kind of gentrification data, but for poverty data, according to the 2010 to 2014 American Community Service 5-year estimates, 16.9% of the overall population in Oklahoma was below the federal poverty level. 22.4% of American Indians were at income below poverty level, and the shocker is 77.5% of American Indians had an income in the previous 12 months that was at or below poverty level. So we have income fluctuation too that is going on. And we definitely have people that are living in poverty through parts of the year. Thank you.
Those are, I'm glad that you all were able to speak to specific communities, but because I think that it helps people just to, you know, put you in the right mind frame. What are we facing here? How large is the problem? And to be thoughtful about why, as you said, those specifics matter in the community where you work, and it's important to start by knowing what you're facing. I think the other thing that I was really struck by, the thing that sort of runs to me as a common theme through each of your comments, is the relationship between economic health, household economic health, community economic health, and other forms of health. Healthy families, mentally and physically. Healthy communities where people feel empowered and able to influence their environment and or really alter it, shape it. And certainly healthy regard for the different levels of types of expertise that people can bring to the table. So I guess I wondered then if you all, each of you perhaps, and again I'll throw this open to the entire group, could speak a little bit to perhaps an example or a way in which you have seen the work that you do contribute more broadly, I think in ways that extend beyond the pocketbook.
I'd like to just say I had the privilege of writing our mayor's executive order many years ago. Her name was Sophie Maslow. I did some research and found out that at that time, African-American contractors in the city of Pittsburgh got 1%. And so just wrote her a letter, just venting, really. And it ended up, she asked me to write her an executive order. And the nice part about it is that I was able, in the city of Pittsburgh now, 25% of all contracts go to minorities. Well, because she elects the Housing Authority Board, I was able to get her to also incorporate Section 3 and resident participation on that 25%. So we were able, when you come to Pittsburgh, if you're doing any Housing Authority work, you have a requirement that residents have a 25% mandate in our city. And because it's a federal mandate already set, it had been on the books by HUD, we just incorporated it into our mayor's executive order. So it is on our books. If I go to a lot of cities, that is not on their books. You know, most housing authorities, when I walk in the door and I say, let me see your 6002 report, that's the report that they have to do when they get any HUD money, community block grants or whatever, they don't even have one. Or they'll say that there's waivers. So what needs to happen is someone needs to be policing these dollars, because the dollars that are supposed to be going into the right pockets are not going into the right pockets.
Before we move on, could you explain just very briefly what Section 3 is?
Section 3 is a law that was passed in 1968, and it was to uplift residents. As I said, public housing was never supposed to be, it was just like Harry Truman with the soldier. It was supposed to be temporary housing. I used to go around and talk about 3 generations live in public housing. I'm now going around talking about 4 generations of people living in public housing. And so this cycle has to quit. And somehow someone, all of us in this room, are negligent, because when we know somebody that lives in public housing, I'm sorry. And we have to be able to uplift residents who live in public housing in some kind of way, form, or fashion. If you don't do nothing but reach out to your mayor, your politician, someone at the housing authority, they have to be held accountable. You know, I'm just one person, you know, and there's people in the audience here from North Carolina. I was just in North Carolina working with council people and the mayors in small cities over there to help them understand that our mayors appoint the board on the housing authority. So I always like to start there to educate them, and we need to educate our politicians, because it's very obvious they're signing off on bills that are not going into people's pockets who it should go into.
In terms of the thinking about the scale of the problem, I think, as Patricia reminded us, it's really difficult to use like a one national number to characterize the scope of the problem. But if I were in a particular local area and trying to assess the size of the problem, the health of the patient, there'll be a number of indicators that I would look at in my city. First and foremost, the poverty rate, as has been mentioned. And I think we discovered 20-some years ago that we could eliminate welfare as we knew it, but that wasn't quite eliminating poverty as we know it. So we have less support, but we still have the same preposterous levels of poverty in this country that should not be tolerated in what's known to be the richest country on earth. Second, I would look at inequality levels, and we know those have gone up over time. We know that the white-black wealth gap is about 13-1. We know that the Latino white wealth gap is about 10-1. So I would also look at differences, you know, wealth gap. 3, I think I would look at residential segregation and levels of residential segregation, which vary by city. Is the poverty and are poverty and race concentrated in place and space? And those vary by city, how concentrated they are, which will give you a sense of the scale of the problem. So really looking at wealth indicators, inequality indicators, residential segregation indicators, poverty indicators, labor market participation indicators ought to go a long way towards giving you a sense within a particular city what the target areas are. There's a professor at Princeton called Douglas Massey who's done a lot of work on residential segregation data. And a professor, last time I tracked him down, was at Rutgers, Newark, Paul Jargowski, who does work at categorizing neighborhoods. And neighborhoods that are stable, neighborhoods that are up and coming and gentrifying, neighborhoods that are stably unstable, and neighborhoods that are on their way down. And if I were to try to get a sense by region, by city, as to the changes in those ratios and proportions, I would look at his work. But again, national, local data can be helpful to move elected officials to take some action. But in the end, in community economic development, it's about community and neighborhood. And I think in that regard, there are projects trying to bring forth better neighborhood level data to bear. But what we typically do is we sort of use neighborhood level data when it's convenient, but when we need to deploy it to make sure that resources follow, somehow we don't have the right tools and the right indicators to know where the problem is, even though we all know where it is. So I think that the data and research are fundamental to taking us to the right place. But once we are in the right place, and I think a lot of us know what those places are, the challenge then becomes, is there an organizational, resident, community-based infrastructure that can mobilize the economic and political elites, do what I need to do. And lastly, I think we've been talking about economic development and community economic development because in the end, you know, we need to eat. We need to have shelter, and economics is extremely important. But I think anyone that's engaged in a discussion of community economic development in low-income and communities of color, and I think Christy exemplified this beautifully when she talked about the word sovereignty. You know, we've almost been taught or made to feel like we're transient in our own communities, that they're not really ours from an ownership perspective. We like sort of temporary borrowing shelter somewhere until we're kicked to the next place. And I'd love to learn more from Christy about how we can move this concept of sovereignty around, which is so ingrained in Native communities, but I don't think we need more of it in Hispanic and perhaps in African American communities. This notion that in Spanish there's I guess today is Spanish saying day here. People used to say no pasarán, which means from this line you will not cross. And I think we as Michael pretty much exemplified, it isn't about can I get mine so I can go and look at my neighborhood in the rear view mirror one last time, but can I get what I need to get to make my neighborhood better so that I can proudly say wherever I go, this is my neighborhood, it's mine, yes. I made it mine, yes. I owe it. And if you want to come here and make some business and make some money, you got to go through us in one or another way. Yes. And I think that we need more of that kind of, yes. And it isn't just about economics, right? It's about, yes. When we talk about our neighborhoods, we talk about a social place, we talk about a cultural place, and we talk about an environmentally sound place. And I think when we look at our neighborhoods, our cultural life is threatened. We are victims of environmental racism in ways that no other communities are. And I think we're essentially told that culture is some kind of a gravy or some kind of extra thing that you may have if there's money for it. So I would hope that when we're talking about community economic development in our neighborhoods, we think about the cultural, the environmental, and the social as much as we're thinking about the economic outcomes.
I'm really glad that you raised this really intriguing idea of sovereignty defined broadly and sort of assets defined very broadly. And I wanted to ask Christy to speak a little more about that. I'm particularly curious about why the organization made the decision to define assets in a way that extends beyond money or actual income or even wealth, you know, assets in the material sense that I think we understand them. And what has come of that? What would you say has come of that?
Okay, sure. So I would say that we built from First Nations Development Institute's model that was generated by Sherry Salway Black, where she has we could show it afterwards. We could try to send it out if people need it, but it's a kind of circle model, and it talks about all of the assets that are important to our community, and including spirituality, et cetera. So it's all connected. And we're place-based people, so we obviously got moved. Like in my particular tribe, we were over several states: Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, et cetera. And then, we get moved eventually out of Missouri, then we go to Kansas, and we go from Kansas to Oklahoma. But now, we're supposed to be place-based for perpetuity. Our tribal seats of government are in rural areas in Oklahoma, and these 39 tribes are supposed to be there now, right? And so there's this other connection to place. So back to where we used to have homeland. So, for example, Osage, a lot of connections back to St. Louis. Back to Cahokia Mounds, right over the border there in Illinois. But then thinking also about being place-based where you are now in Oklahoma. So water rights are a big issue. How are we going to be sustainable for generations in this land where we're supposed to now be? And because of that kind of place-based piece, and that generally most of us are all kind of related within our tribes in some form or another by marriage of families to families, it creates a different kind of, I think, perspective for some of the decisions we make about asset building program and program design. And so we did talk about, this asset building piece because it just naturally kind of flows, and because we realized that we didn't want to have to shove our tribes into cookie cutter programs for economic development that don't always work. And it gets irritating when that happens, sometimes with the federal sources of funding that happens, but really, when we're doing the trainings in TA and we can say, there are some ways that you can adjust this a little bit here and there to try to have a good cultural fit, the light bulb goes on and people say, thank God. Okay, well, we're going to try that then, And then the models kind of get shared back and forth and people get really excited about it. So that's what we're kind of building off of. It just is kind of flowing organically, quite honestly. And, I have a 1-year-old daughter. As a 40-year-old mom, I want to be around with her as long as I can. But, thinking about Annalise is a tribal member now too, like what is her future? And, so how do we strengthen our tribe so that when she is an adult woman, she can also still participate and be able to give back, but also to connect. So those are all pieces that kind of are related there. And I think that some of these models and the ideas could then be shared with other communities of color. And you don't have the same legal connections with sovereign nations, but the principles and ideas about staying connected to family and staying connected to places, I think, can still be replicated. And so hopefully, as we try and get some of these models published, maybe they would be of use to other people.
What I hear you talking about is internal value and expertise, and I'm intrigued by that. I guess I was also struck, and this to me seems somewhat related, but maybe I'm wrong, but something that Ms. Smith said, which is you were talking about the work that you do, you aim to create opportunities for low-wealth people and places. And I wondered if you would talk with us just a little bit about the ways in which you try to measure each of those things. I think that, as has been mentioned by several people on the panel, there's been probably decades and decades of focus on whether or not you get these 6 big box stores or these known chains, I think we could all name them all, drugstores to come in, and this signals that this community is being redeveloped. But what are the measures or indicators that there's been some improvement or some impact on the lives of people in communities, and for that matter, on the physical space that you all track most closely?
Right. Well, some of the metrics that we may look at is, of course, not only was a job created, but whether or not it's a quality job, whether or not the job offers a career path, even if it doesn't offer within that institution, can it be connected to other forms of jobs? That's one way. With the metrics about place, you kind of pay attention to a couple of things. You do, I think, because we are in America, you do look at what's happening to home values and property values and things like that. Is that changing? What's the rate of change? And that's one of the reasons which led us to say, let's now think about the relationship of income within a community to property values to say, can that help become a predictor of the likelihood of displacement? Because the property values and home values are outstripping incomes. Or even if a person or family is able to hold on to their home within the community, we also say, before it was also about whether or not the child of that person can afford to come back into the community. So, you know, so we're looking at those things, and then thinking, then how do you sort of like manage that growth in such a way that it sort of like, I don't want to say stop it, because I think everyone wants to live in a community that's doing well, but how do you manage it in such a way that it's balanced? And there are all kinds of tools that, you know, we've begun to put in place to think about that. But, you know, I think those are like, you know, two types of metrics. I think on the social capital, we've partnered with, and I'm glad Hector mentioned that, we've done a lot of work with a organization called the Social Impact of the Arts, and they have done a lot of measuring of the presence of not big cultural institutions, but it could be a sewing circle or other types of cultural activities, and are finding that in turn that creates a sense of civic connection. And if you're connected to your community and engaged in your community, you're more likely to do things like vote. So the interesting to trace this, you know, art to voting and civic participation. So, you know, that's just a couple of the things that we've taken a look at. I think some of that is reflected on a website we call Culture Blocks, where we really go deep into, you know, those community assets that we don't traditionally think of as assets, you know.
I think that's a very natural transition to something else. I was really interested in both Mr. Cordero-Guzman's comments and Mr. Berry's comments, which is Mr. Cordero-Guzman made reference to the frequency with which condescension sort of becomes a part of the community redevelopment process, or this notion that experts can come in and determine what is best. And while people in communities may have varying levels of expertise on economic matters or physical building matters, they do have a sense of where they would like their communities to go and why those things work or will not work in their communities, what they really need. I also heard Mr. Berry say something very similar. You said, you know, that you went into this meeting expecting to really, you were asked to come and sort of give advice, and you learned a great deal. I wondered if each of you, and certainly I'm open to others on the panel, but I wondered if each of you could speak just a bit to two things. One, what are some of the ways in which you have seen most frequently this sort of condescension play itself out in the community redevelopment process? And I say that because I think that sometimes this is the nature of condescension. People do not realize that that is what they're doing. So what are some of the most frequent ways you've seen that play itself out? And frankly, what are some of the types of expertise that you think live in communities that are often overlooked or not heard?
Okay, I'll speak to that. A lot of people don't know that a lot of individuals in public housing, some have been people who have left public housing, went and fought in the war, come back with all kind of expertise, and there are just people who live in public housing. There are nurses, there are electricians, there are people that have a lot of expertise. That image that people have of people in public housing, I can tell you that they don't want to work. That is not correct. And I can tell you, Michael is a perfect example, but there's a lot of Michaels, maybe not with the big vision, but they have expertise. And the opportunity that Michael has brought now to his community, because the next phase, Michael has about 165 acres. And his next phase is military housing and along with affordable housing. He's attracted one of the largest minority developers in the world. It's called Urban America, Richmond McCoy. Richmond McCoy has now come and partnered with Michael to help, along with myself. Me and Richmond were friends, and once I showed him the vision of what Michael is doing, we have now formed a partnership, all three of us, So we go around the country to help others who have the vision, and now Michael has the expertise. And because Michael is a resident management corporation, he can now go to other cities. We call him, he's mobile, and he can actually sit on a board of another housing authority, and one of their board members can sit on his housing authority, and they automatically have resident management abilities. And see, resident management means that they have the same rights as a local housing authority. They can develop their community. They don't have to go ask the housing authority no more for when the washing machine breaks, can you bring me one? I mean, it's totally ridiculous how people in public housing are treated. And I've seen women who have literally had to sell their body to get something done inside their units. You just look at Baltimore, they had a $6 million lawsuit about that. So Michael has now formed a team of expertise where he can now go around the country and help others be able to come out of their situation. And then one of our other partners, Chris Ivory there, is a realtor. So now we are working with several banks. We got several banks, several mortgage companies, as Michael was getting his people ready for home ownership in his community. So the banks are taking the voucher for a mortgage payment, for home ownership. So there's a lot of things that we're doing to create opportunities. Hector?
The biggest challenge that I see in neighborhoods that have now become attractive for developers is and I use the word condescending again, the kind of casual, condescending way in which the neighborhood review process is treated as another inconvenience and stumbling block that has to be removed in order for us being the developers, do what we need to do. And a completely manipulated, cynical process is put underway where the goal should be to maximize community participation and input. And in fact, the way the process is set up is almost set up to minimize. It's almost meetings that they don't want anyone to show up. Because if they know people show up, they're going to start making demands, and they don't want to necessarily face the demands. So I think, and where your local elected official is in this process is going to be determinative in terms of how the process will unfold. There are parts of the country where local elected officials are, tools of the development interests. And there are parts of the country where local elected officials have much better connection to the grassroots and are able to more strategically and smartly not necessarily stop the developments. You don't want to stop some, or you want to change others. Yeah. And there are local elected officials that are smart enough to know that if you want to come and invest in my community, I'm going to have to make sure that I get some. And what is it that I get? First, they're known as community benefits agreements. And again, a lot of developers will hear this the first time, and it's like you're showing them, like they're vampires, and you're showing them the cross, And there are local officials that say to developers, my job is to protect you against the community from getting a community benefits agreement, so long as you take care of me. So communities need to be very straightforward about what the concessions, demands they're going to make if they're going to let a developer or an economic project come into their neighborhood. And I've seen from very well thought out, we'll let you build, but you're going to have to put $500,000 a year in this nonprofit in the neighborhood to sponsor these kinds of projects, or some percent of the profit or whatever else. So community benefits agreements are a tool if supported by the local elected officials. There are, again, cities where the mayor will tell the community, that's not your job to negotiate that, it's my job to negotiate that, and I'm going to get what I need to get, and good luck to you. I think local source agreements, and again, Mr. Berry is a developer, so he may have different reactions to some of this, and would love, in fact, to hear them. Local source agreements where, and especially in partnership with a local or a workforce organization that can actually ensure that local folks are trained for the jobs, could guarantee that a portion of the jobs in the building and in the actual economic development activity would go to neighborhood residents. That doesn't happen. I mean, the invisible hand of the labor market is not going to grab you and put you in that job. It has to be a very visible hand of economic development planning and workforce development planning that does some asset mapping and tries to match the residents to the opportunities. And the third will be local sourcing, which is, again, sometimes a little harder. And I'm sure, again, as a developer, you have a lot of opportunity of, but requiring, maybe even demanding that a proportion of the contracts and subcontracts go to both nonprofit and for-profit minority-owned entities. Those are three mechanisms that I've seen where communities can kind of put some bite. But that happens when communities are organized. I've been to community meetings where you can see it's just residents. And I've been to community meetings where you look in a corner and there's 50 residents with the same T-shirt. They win. So organizing and organization, I think, is key to getting. It's not that we don't know what we want. We certainly do. And it's not that neighborhoods can envision how they want the neighborhood to be 20, 25 years from now. There's tons of tools we have to ensure that happens. Is how do we ensure that through local hiring, local sourcing, and community benefits agreements, we have the resources and a structure that can make some of those gains more sustainable in the medium and long term for existing residents in that neighborhood. And lastly, I mean, in places like New York where there's requirements for some proportion of affordability, and how affordable that affordability is becomes a question. But ensuring, again, that if there's going to be a new development, existing neighborhood residents have preference in that system, I think are 4 or 5 tools that are critical, but they don't happen by themselves. They only happen in communities that are organized. And the federal government doesn't necessarily support organizing. City governments don't necessarily support organizing, so that's why we need foundations and other entities to really step up to the plate to do that.
I'd like to just say one more thing. When Michael first had the idea and we started putting together the roadmap, Michael created his own 501c3. And so with that 501c3 and how we were able to get the upper hand on the housing authority is I took Michael to meet Brian Hudson from Pennsylvania Housing Finance. And so Brian sat and listened to Michael's story. And Brian sat there and said, in 23 years, he had never had a resident submit a 9% tax credit. Well, Michael submitted the 9% tax credit, so Michael controlled the money. Well, when the local housing authority found out that Michael could submit his own tax credits and didn't have to go through the local housing authority, and I'll close on this one. At the end of the day, the local housing authority called Michael and said, "Can I please partner with you a little piece of this development?" And Michael allowed them to do that. So that goes to show you that what you can do if you are determined. And I got to just say, this young man, I told you I represent 40,000 residents, and God bless every one of them. But he is very unique, very different. And through all the trials and tribulations, he lost his mother along the way, only child. That was his support. But I let him know that God had a plan for him. He had a vision. And to make her proud, he had to carry out the vision. We had a lot of prayers. My sister's a pastor. She would call him from Tennessee. He'd call her when he got weak, and but God brought him through.
I think we're going to, it's a good place to end and open this discussion up, because I think what we've heard from our panel here today is really that it seems that developing the lives of people who live in challenging economic situations and the communities around them really has to be much more comprehensive than I think we've most often witnessed in our cities and in our rural communities around the country. And that when done well, the benefits are much larger and expand well beyond our pocketbooks. But our pocketbooks can do well also. So I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. And if anyone doesn't have any questions, not to worry, I have a notebook full of them to get us started. I always do. But I'll open the floor. I see that there is someone, in fact, with a question right back here.